Hi everyone, welcome to Here We Are, Brattleboro's community talk show. I'm Wendy O'Connell, and our guest today is Susan Avery. Susan was born and raised in Brattleboro, and she is still living here. She recently wrote the book, Addicted, Our Strength Under the Influence. Susan's memoir shares the reality of how addiction transforms a family, the immediacy of needing skills, the resources and courage to cope with raw emotions in the midst of trauma and constant unpredictability, and also how family can be the greatest source of strength. Welcome, Susan.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so pleased to be here.
Well, I'm really happy to have you on the show. Your book came out this spring, and I know you've been doing some nice promotion around it. It's getting some attention,
Yes.
which is great and needed. Going back a little bit before we take on the book, you did grow up here. You grew up here in Brattleboro, and you went to Academy School when it was a building right down from the Academy School where it is now.
It was a wooden structure, a two-story wooden structure.
That was back when West Brattleboro was kind of its own village. And I think I probably mentioned this on the show before as well to other folks. We had two grocery stores, Stockwell's and Ziders, which had a deli and takeout. And we had the annex to the library as part of Academy School. There was a little diner even down from Stockwell's.
That's right. Yeah.
The fire station was there. I mean, it really was its own little village.
It was, and so handy to have the little grocery stores right at the bottom of South Street, which is where my family moved to in 1955, having lived on Canal Street as an infant, on Brook Street as a toddler, and it was very close to Brattleboro Memorial Hospital, where my mother was a registered nurse. And it was very close to Elm Street, where my dad owned his own business, Avery Machine Shop.
You were talking about your mom, who was, I believe, the director of the nurses at Brattleboro Memorial Hospital.
She was.
And then you also, I don't know if it was high school, you had a job at Johnson's Nursing Home, which was on the corner where Winston Prouty used to be.
That's right. It was a time when allowance wasn't enough for my spending habits because my mother was a nurse and I was constantly around that jargon and was kind of interested in nursing in general. And so when I applied to become a nurse's aide, that's what I did. Another
Perhaps little known fact is that you were an elf at Santa's Land.
Yes, I was.
I love that.
Yeah. You know, it was in my 2 years, the summer of sophomore and junior year. And it was pretty enjoyable time, and there were several of us from Brattleboro and a couple of girls from Hinsdale. We used to carpool, and we would wear black shorts, white shirts, and red ribbon suspenders, and we would wear an elf hat, which was red with a green feather, as I remember. I did work at the Holiday Restaurant as a waitress during high school also. I was very ambitious and was very interested in getting out and being out, and worked for George and Theda Trianafel. They owned the Holiday Restaurant, which of course now is Wyndham Flowers, right there on the corner. Next door was Montgomery Ward's, where Brown and Roberts are.
And now Brown and Roberts, right? And then across the street, was it W.T. Grant's across the street then?
Yes, W.T. Grant and F.W. Woolworth, and very early on, St. Michael's Episcopal Church. Was there where my family were members, and I was baptized on Main Street right there. And then a few years later, I think it was in the early 50s, they rolled that church on logs and and a base with wheels, and it was pretty fantastic.
And it was a brick building too,
It was.
So it was
intact, and away it went.
That made like 4 churches right on downtown Main Street. So many of them have been repurposed
And good and well. I mean,
very
well received.
Yeah,
enjoyable.
it's really wonderful to go into some of them, and even when Hotel Pharmacy was there, it still felt like a church. Before that, Delectable Mountain was there too. Right?
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow, we could go on for a while with that. That's a great thing about living in a town for a long time.
Well, growing up here was a pretty special place, and I as I said, I lived in West Brattleboro, but all I needed to do was hop on my bike and 7/10 of a mile down the hill, and I'd be on Western Avenue heading out to wherever, Lexington Avenue, or over to the Little League field on South Main, which of course is still there.
Yes.
And that was a popular place to hang out.
That's true. You could get around on a bike. Of course, Brattleboro, of course, has its hills.
Indeed. I know my dad would say, well, you know, you went down, what goes down must come up. And I was always pushing the bike back up the hill.
During those years, Susan, did you, what were you interested in doing, aside from the nursing home and being an elf?
Well, let's see. As a youngster, I spent a great deal of time on Belmont Avenue, where as I call them, my Nana and Bumpa, my mother's mom and dad lived. And my mother was working, and Dad was working. My sister was yet to be born, so it was something that I did almost every weekend. And one of the things that I talk about in my book is the qualifier for addiction in my family. And one of the things that I came to realize was quite normal in my family was that my grandfather often would stop after work, and he was a postal carrier in the local Brattleboro post office, and carried badge number 1. And those were the days when mail was delivered twice a day, all on foot. If he wasn't home by a certain time, she and I would get in the car and we would go driving around, and she would find him in, I think it was Ray's Restaurant on Elliott Street, was a favorite watering hole. And I would be right there with her, and she would go in and he would come out, and ensuing words, not to be repeated. But that was a culture that I think was very dominant in our town, and I think alcohol was well used by many people.
Absolutely, and stopping after work to have a quick beer, before you go home. Cocktail hours in the suburbs, became a real thing.
It was.
I noticed that you dedicated your book to your mother, and it sounds like, at least with your mother, that you had a real caregiving culture in your family.
I would say that between my mother and my grandmother, I was very well loved, very well nurtured, and that is something that I think a great deal about. During my parents' marriage, they really were a working unit. They sat down every Sunday, and they would have cash on the table. They would have little envelopes, and they would budget their money and so on and so forth. So they really were strong in their relationship. I was 17 when I graduated from high school and went to college for a little while and came back home. I married Jim, my first husband, and we were married when I was 18.
In the family that you created, you had 2 kids.
I say that in 1968, motherhood birthed my memoir. My son was born. And 2 years later, we were in the Albany area, Albany, New York, and that's where our daughter was born. And from there, we moved around a great deal, eventually settling in Pennsylvania, which is where we separated and divorced.
When your kids were in school, did you see any of this coming? Did you get any inklings in their behaviors?
Well, here's where I'd like to say something about parenting. I'm quite sure that many of the folks tuning in here are parents. And when you are a young mother, you are doing your very best to nurture your child and bring them up in the way that you know how. And I think that a lot of times there's an interference with what you've learned as a child coming out of your home. And so in most cases, you'll attempt to raise your children as you had been raised. And the difference in my family was, of course, that my parents stayed married, and I was divorced when my children were 4 and 6. And so during that period of time, I needed to find a job.
Right.
And I was not able to be a stay-at-home mom.
Yeah.
Could things have been different if my husband and I had stayed married, or if I didn't have to have a job, but
Right.
things were what they were, and I believe that things happened with my children that might not have happened. Maybe there was a loneliness factor. Loneliness is often the basis for addiction.
In those beginning years, how was it for you?
So again, when something new comes into your existence,
Right.
addiction enters your home, your life is of course changed forever, and you have no idea what you're going to be dealing with. And you don't know that it is a forever thing.
Right.
When my daughter spoke to me about her heroin addiction, she had 2 small children at the time, ages 7 and 9. And I sincerely had no idea that this had been going on for some time. I was working and I was single, I was living by myself. She was at my house and came storming out of the door and said, "Mom, you've got to help me. You've got to help me. I'm addicted to heroin." And I mean, really, truly, no idea. So being me, I said, "Okay, well, now what? Now what are we going to do?" And so she said, I have a detox bed in Dublin, New Hampshire. So dropped everything. And my partner then at the time, Karen, was there with my grandchildren, and I drove to Dublin, New Hampshire, and took her to what I thought was going to be a one and done kind of thing. I'm just going to bring her here, and she'll get the help she needs, and that was the beginning. And I know we haven't touched on my son here because I was so busy taking care of my grandchildren. Unbeknownst to me, there were some things that were going on in his lives that were very dark.
Yeah. Reading the book, you can see what you went through. You can see what the journey was, and that feeling like getting help, and there was help available, but then the relapsing, and it was years and years that with both children going through that.
The 2 older grandchildren had a relationship with their dad, and during this process, he gave me guardianship. I was stymied. I thought, well, I'm their grandmother. I'm a family member. I am someone they have spent a lot of time with, and why is this going to be so hard? Well, the difficult part, of course, was that they wanted to be living with their mother.
Yeah.
They didn't want to be living with me.
Yep.
And of course, eventually they did live and stayed with me until they graduated from high school.
Wow.
So when my daughter was living out of town with others, just say that, she became pregnant. And so my 3rd granddaughter did not have the same dad as the 2 older grandchildren. So when she came to live with us, she was 3 years old, and my daughter had terminated her parental rights, so I was able to adopt her into permanency.
So you had another whole life of bringing up kids, and again, at that time, Susan, what were your resources?
There were a lot of people who were part of our family during this time, and I was never afraid to ask for help. One of the things that I did even before Nar-Anon and bringing the chapter to Nar-Anon was to become involved in what was known as the Grandparents Support Group. There was David Bayer and Jennifer Mazer over on Bird Street at Triple E Services, and they had the brilliant idea of forming a grandparent support group, and there were always at least 5 to 7 or 8 of us, even back then in the year 2000. So that was really helpful.
Yeah.
So the other thing is that I had lost my job when the children came because our company was purchased by another larger a competitor, and the same school-based clinician said, "Hey, I think you should be in touch with Casey Family Services. Now, many people have never heard of Casey Family Services, but I'll bet you've heard of Annie E. Casey, the Annie E. Casey Foundation on NPR, BPR, and how they have been an organization that have been around a long, long time. And so I said, well, gee, how would I have any reason to contact Casey Family Services? But then I have had this need, and now I need to figure out how I'm going to support our family.
Yeah.
And so I contacted them. We went through an extensive application process. And what this allowed me to do was to stay at home because they accepted us under their umbrella. And by that, I mean they were very financially generous. And so I did not have to go out and earn a living and raise grandchildren at the same time. This really allowed me to be a parent.
Yes.
Perhaps a better parent than I was the first time around.
Second chances, right?
Yeah.
And opportunities that come to you. Yeah. You had a lot of determination. You were really
Driven.
dedicated to making this work,
That's
dedicated
right.
to your
That's
children and your grandchildren and the family itself. What do you do if the help isn't wanted?
Well, one of the things to counteract that is that I would get up very early every morning and I would be out walking at 5 or 5:15 in the morning. That was a ritual that I made myself do, and it was very comforting because for me, living in my hometown, I've been able to take from my town what I've needed in order to have the support I've needed to go forward. In other words, as I've talked about walking along Maple Street and looking up at my grandparents' house on Belmont Avenue, a little further down on walking on Maple Street is the huge American chestnut tree that sits right on the corner of Cherry and Maple, and that was a tree that my mother could just hardly wait until the fruit dropped and the frost came and the chestnuts were there lying on the ground. And that's something that I've done with all of my children, my grandchildren, and now my great-granddaughter.
Wow.
So that was really cool. But what I'm talking about is the familiarity of being in my hometown, and who can say that anymore? People have become so mobile that maybe I'm one of a kind, but I have just really embraced my walk every day, where I could walk by the hospital where I was born, where my mother was the director of nurses, and on down Canal Street and down by Canal Street School, Brook Street where I lived, down Elm Street where my dad's business was, and down around the corner and down onto Main where Latches Theater. Sam's was the Army and Navy. I don't believe it was called Sam's now. Yep. And my grandmother worked in a dress shop, the Francis store, and then on up to the Paramount Theater where you could go to the movies for a quarter. So, this was something that I did every day. Right. And it just reinforced my security in my home. I believe we can all do something somehow to help the folks that are really suffering, as we see daily in our lives and in our walk down Main Street, where you are. And people can figure out what to do. And my idea was to continue to work with families, because families are very, very important. And where are the families for the folks we see? That's my big question. I don't know where they are. As I said, I wanted to give back to my community because I had received so much and appreciated that. I brought a chapter of Nar-Anon here in the year 2000, and that meeting is still going on today. Wow.
Starting Nar-Anon, when you did, that was like almost 25 years ago, right? That was kind of before there was so much understanding and awareness of drugs and addiction.
Nar-Anon was something that became a way of life for me. And if folks who have been to Nar-Anon or Al-Anon, for example, is the same principle. However, there is an element of crime and danger that is attached to illegal substance, where alcohol is something that is perfectly legal. You can go anywhere and buy.
That's a really good point.
You can buy. But people can come to our now new meeting. So we're meeting over at the old Familari building off of Old Guilford Road, the Big Red Barn.
The Big Red Barn,
And so we're meeting there every other Monday at 7 o'clock, and folks can contact me or what have you.
And we'll have, at the end of the show, we'll have credits.
Okay.
So we'll have the contact information there. The book itself is such a powerful and compelling account of what your family went through. We haven't really talked about the harrowing experiences, you know, that you all lived through together and in different ways, and how you struggled with all of this. But for you writing the book, how was that?
I hadn't thought about writing a book, of course. When we entered this arena, we were just busy running hard and fast, trying to keep up with what we needed to do. My faith was abiding. I was not really clear on how I was going to do this, but somehow I gained strength and managed to find a way to the first segment of figuring out how to write this book.
Yeah.
And as I said, you know, I have grown up here. I have a lot of friends. Our high school class, BUHS class of 1964, we are an awesome group of people, and we are closer than ever now.
Amazing.
And so when I was looking at the possibility of writing this book, I was talking with a classmate who lives in Pennsylvania, and he said, I have a niece who has gone to college as an English major, and I'll bet if you give her a call, perhaps she can help you get started. And that's exactly what I did. And so we started rolling. There are standalone chapters that are written by family members.
Yes.
And so it's a unique perspective, because it's not all about me, and it's not all about anyone. It is a combination of family members and their commentary and talking about their feelings of what it was like. My husband, we became much better friends than a married couple. It was astonishing how we were able to be a real force in our family of strength and togetherness. Back in 2006, there was a reformer reporter, Carolyn Laurie, who came to our home and did a front page article on our family and how we were two women living together, raising 3 children, and we had exposure going way back then.
I think a lot of what your book is doing is breaking the stigma of this and addiction, and that includes addiction and mental health, the fact that addiction is a disease. Could you speak to that a little bit?
When I was formulating the plan for my book, I knew that stigma, of course, was something that was very prevalent. It exists today, and it's going to continue to exist in homes and with people who have not been affected by addiction in their family. And I think that, you don't wish that to happen to anyone, but it does certainly bring a different awareness to your life when you are living the life of someone who is addicted, and you are trying your very best not to become them, in a sense, because addiction is not what people choose. I'm quite sure that any number of people who think about their lives and think about where they are now, and in despair and in poor health, perhaps in jail, they have to look back on their lives and say, what happened?
Yeah, one thing that your book points out is how the systems, there are many things in place, but there are many systems that are just not working. And I know you had a lot of encounters with coming up against walls time after time.
We did. And I would say that perseverance is a strong suit.
Susan, how's the family now? How are things now for you?
Right now, my oldest granddaughter is is 34. She has a daughter who is going to be 11 in November. My grandson is 33. He has been in the Army and is now in reserves and going to UMass Amherst to become a physician's assistant. So he's taken a hold of his life and making it his own. And then my youngest granddaughter is 22. She has a child who will be a year old on December the 27th. My son was incarcerated in 2021 after an arrest for drug-related charges. And so he was released in May of this year and is on his own right now. My daughter has been clean and sober for 5 years, and she's on what is referred to as an MAT, which is medicated assisted treatment. She is on methadone. She owns her own business in Greenfield, and while we don't see each other, we are only a phone call away.
Yes. Right.
She doesn't have a strong relationship with her son or her youngest daughter. Her oldest daughter and she do have, they have conversations occasionally. But there's a lot of damage as a result of this. It's really hard. It's really hard.
Again, you have been so determined, to work at this and to help and to give all kinds of, tools and skills, and done the best that you can. You've done the best that you can. And for you to, I think, for you to write this book and to let people know that there are different ways of survival, for one thing.
That's very true.
Yeah, and it is so individual, as is addiction. So every story is different. Every road to recovery or road that is taken is individual. And from my point of view, having read the book and talking to you, I know that you've done your very, very best. And that really shows.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. It's been a work in progress, and I have just really tried to immerse myself in all ways possible to think of the other person and know that that person is really struggling, and I've been there.
Yeah.
How I've managed to survive it is through my Nar-Anon program. It was a lifesaver.
Yeah.
I sat in awe last night. We had our third meeting, and there were 14 people around that table willing to share what was going on in their lives, and all in varying stages of what do we do now.
Right.
The other thing that I wanted to talk about just briefly is that when my grandchildren came to live with me, I had been working at a long-time job for almost 20 years at what was known as Stowe Mills, and I was the executive assistant to the CEO. And little did I know all of the skills that I was learning over that 20-year period of time were those that I would be able to then apply to my next life. And one of the things that came along, and I look at my life as a series of crossroads and opportunities. I mean, think about typing 1 and 2 in high school, going to college for only a brief time, and having doors open to me and opportunities that I just fell into for whatever reason, and just made my way through a variety of different wonderful jobs and have had a wonderful career. I've had a wonderful life. I am not going to sit here and complain. It's been hard. It's really been difficult. But from my point of view of what I've been able to accomplish, at least with the folks who have been members of our group, I know that I've made a difference for many.
Susan, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you for writing this book.
Thank you.
I think it's going to have a really big impact. I think it is having a very big impact. There's nothing like stories that are, that you have lived through, and that that you have firsthand knowledge of. Nothing like it. And this is our town.
Well,
and this all happened in our town.
That is very true. And you can't let addiction define you.
Right.
You can rise above it.
Right.
You can figure it out. And if you have a family member, a loved one who's really struggling with it, there are ways around it. You may not like it, but love your family member, love your friend,
Yes.
and hate the disease. Yeah.
Thanks, Susan.
You're welcome.
Thanks to all of you for joining us today for this very enlightening and helpful show with Susan Avery. And again, the information will be at the end of the show of where you can get in touch for various things. Her book, again, is Addicted, Our Strength Under the Influence. So be aware of that. It's available at Everyone's Books in town. And you can always get in touch with Susan as well for any other information of the things that she talked about here today. So again, see you next time. Thanks so much for tuning in.